We'll start. A few people might come in.
Boa tarde a todos, muito obrigado por terem vindo. Eu começava pelos agradecimentos e então, em meu nome e do Felipe, gostávamos de agradecer à Bárbara e à Nauta, à galeria, por nos receber e fazer aqui o evento. Gostava também de agradecer ao professor Jorge Figueira, ao professor e arquiteto Jorge Figueira, por ter lido o livro e pronto, e transmitir-nos algumas impressões sobre o livro e a qualidade e a sua contribuição para o livro e para que este evento também acontecesse. Eu começava por fazer uma breve introdução sobre o Felipe e também apresentar o professor Jorge Figueira e depois haveria uma apresentação pelo Felipe sobre o livro e segue um comentário do professor Figueira. O Felipe é arquiteto, professor da Universidade de Virgínia, teve um percurso académico que também passou anteriormente pela Universidade de Harvard, portanto é um ilustre académico. Entretanto, estabelecido já em Nova Iorque, foi fundador e sócio é fundador e sócio de um coletivo de arquitetura chamado Sabático Collaborative, que tem se dedicado à investigação e ao desenho em vários pontos do globo. Além disso, tem participado de um projeto chamado South America Project, o qual tem trazido investigação em arquitetura na América do Sul. O professor Jorge Figueira é professor de arquitetura na Universidade de Coimbra e é um especialista sobre São Paulo, já visitou várias vezes e tem trabalhado em estreita colaboração com académicos de São Paulo e pronto, é um expert sobre a cidade e pensamos que pudesse ser uma mais-valia para fazer um comentário sobre o livro. O livro insere-se numa estratégia de uma série de publicações que têm acontecido sobre cidades, metrópoles à escala global. Digamos, São Paulo, ao contrário de outros, por exemplo, Nova Iorque, quando há uma geometria muito definida de uma unidade a partir da qual cresceu a cidade, neste caso a ilha de Manhattan, ou por exemplo Paris, que também pode ser identificado pelas linhas que Haussmann abriu. São Paulo, pelo contrário, é uma cidade que é uma imensidão, onde há fortes contrastes que acontecem. Isso é refletido pelo grande trabalho que o Felipe e a sua equipe fizeram. Portanto, é uma cidade, ele identifica uma série de modelos urbanos que passam por uma cidade de vazios, uma cidade de pontos, uma cidade de armazéns, uma cidade de redes urbanas das quais ele fez levantamentos e que cruzou uma data de informação, bastante informação, quer em desenho, quer em texto, e para o qual contribuíram alguns peritos, nomeadamente agora de memória. Lembro-me de um texto bastante interessante sobre Nuno de Carvalho, e pronto, eu se calhar passava, depois destas palavras de introdução, passava Felipe, I'll ask you to start
my presentation. Okay. Very good. Well, thank you so much for the. We have two options: English or Spanish. Portuguese, unfortunately, is not. I mean, we could, but it might not work well for anyone. So, English, okay?
I prefer English.
English.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go with English. So, first of all, Nuno, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks a lot to Barbara as well for sort of hosting and organizing this beautiful event. And of course, thank you so much for Claudia for being here and for supporting this incredible project. So, what I would like to do is just very briefly go over the sort of main topics of the book, so then we can sort of unfold on a conversation. So I don't want to speak for more than maybe 5 or 7 minutes, but I do want to give an overview, not just of sort of the themes of the book, but also how the project started and what I think are the important elements within the project. And the first thing that I have to say is that I've done similar projects in many other cities. We did a project that was similar in Quito, Ecuador, for the metro project. We did one for Mexico City, working with Ingenieros Civiles Asociados. But in the case of, and in both cases they had actually called me to do the project. São Paulo was a city I always wanted to do a project. It was the other way around. And for me, from the first time that I was there, I was always fascinated in understanding how sort of this came to be. What is the logic that explains this massive sort of urbanization of what I called sort of spreads and densities, these series of points that extend endlessly throughout the landscape. And a lot of this also had to do with some of my sort of previous work that began to look at São Paulo from the perspective of the hinterland, or the interior, and primarily the transformation of the Paraná River into a hydroelectric Eden that actually allowed São Paulo to gain significant and steady sources of electricity for industrialization, one of the major forces for its process of urbanization. So for us, the point of the project was twofold. One, it was to be able to understand what is the larger history of the urban form of São Paulo as a nodal point between the Port of Santos and the hinterland, always understood as a city that sits at the crossroads of sort of global markets and resource extraction within the interior. And what are not only the major challenges that São Paulo faces today, but what are the lessons? And one thing that's extremely important to, I think, explain when one is thinking, or when we were developing this book, is that São Paulo not only has a lot of sort of urban problems like every other city, but it also has an incredible legacy of urbanism, an incredible legacy of architects, an incredible legacy of visionaries that have shaped it. And in many ways, the book begins to synthesize these two conditions. So, before I go into the specifics of each of the chapters, I think books like this, on the one hand, sort of create a significant amount of knowledge and disciplinary know-how about the city itself. But they also become an opportunity to create incredible teams that come together. And I always like to speak a little bit about sort of the team that put the book together. Of course, I was leading the team, but it had a team of approximately 9 to 10 people, many of them based in the US. This is a project that started when I was at Harvard University and finished as I moved to the University of Virginia. And I always like to emphasize not only the names of the people, but the diversity of disciplines and backgrounds that came to working in this project and also came to know São Paulo. So if we actually just look by countries, not by names, but by countries, we have United States, Mexico, France, Hong Kong, Greece, South Korea, US, Hong Kong, China, Uruguay, Brazil, Mexico but lives in Brazil, Portugal, in Brazil. So in many ways, it also became an opportunity for great forms of exchange. And of course, the incredible support of Claudia de Haddad Foundation, which is really who brought everybody together and made the project possible. Another component, you might think this is an odd image to show. Why am I sort of here with somebody else? But this is Neil Donnelly. Neil Donnelly is the graphic designer of the book. And one thing that's extremely important is that rather than doing the work and then sort of hiring a graphic designer to put it together, we brought the graphic designer from the start. So the structure and the design of the book is directly aligned to the structure and the design of the way that we thought the project, the way that we thought the city. And the book is divided into three main parts. What we would say sort of past, present, and future. And the past is primarily the graphic biography. A reading of São Paulo through 8 different lenses, through 8 different categories that begin to explain a city that to many is seen as sort of expansive and unmanageable. It begins to explain what are the primary principles that actually shaped it. The second part begins to sort of focus a little bit more on the precise area of study that we examined, which is the area between sort of major rail line infrastructure and the Tietê River, and the way that this sort of, through a restructuring of hydrological infrastructure, can become a new frontier for urbanization. And for that, we argued that there are 3 key elements that need to happen. One is a new hydrological project around the river. São Paulo as a city has always had a very utilitarian relationship to its rivers. They've always been put to the use of something, to the use of industry, to the use of highway infrastructure. And in many ways, like many other cities, São Paulo today needs to begin to rethink how that infrastructure establishes perhaps a less utilitarian and a more romantic relationship to the city. How does it actually begin to incorporate the river into the life of the city, as many other cities have actually done? And for that, we argue that there are 3 key components: the reorganization of hydrology, the reorganization of mobility infrastructure, and the restructuring of the industrial areas into new urban blocks. And that part of the book begins to look at how mobility projects and hydrological projects throughout the world have transformed larger districts in cities. And then the last part of the book is a series of design strategies that begin to look at possibilities of transforming the river at a very large scale, but that then can begin to open the dialogue to more sort of precise, intermediate scale transformations. So if we actually go through each of the categories, we have a city of ridges and valleys, which begins to look at hydrology, a city of citadels, which begins to look at the history of the urban fabric, the history of the urban grain, city of points, that begins to look at this expansive notion of verticalization, city of spreads and densities, which begins to look at issues of mobility infrastructure, city of voids, looking at ideas of open space, housing, warehouses, which is primarily beginning to look at the heritage of industrial districts within along the river and the rail line, and the city of layered economies, which begins to look at how sort of different industries and services have actually changed location over time. And this was actually done through very detailed examination of geospatial data by a company called Biografia Gráfica, which is Tadeu Massano, which really, like very few cities, very few cities have this. They've really been able to amass a level of GIS data with detail that is really remarkable. I think that there are very few cities that have that level of data organized in that manner. So just to give you an example of one of the chapters, I'm not going to go into many of them in that detail, but for example, hydrology, each of the chapters begins with an archival image of São Paulo, primarily in the 1910s or 1920s. This is sort of where the Tietê, where the 2 rivers actually meet. Then we go sort of to an explanation of the topic of the chapter, in this case hydrology, and the way that sort of a larger floodplain over time has actually been put a straitjacket and turned into a series of canals that today are at capacity. And that's primarily the issue, especially in the area around the Tietê River, which is that sort of the city in many ways needs to move to a new model, a hydrological model, that works with water, not one that contains water within sort of very tight boundaries. And then we always finish a chapter, after we've gone through the entire explanation of the topic, with a photograph that was commissioned to Leonardo Finotti. Leonardo Finotti is one of the best Brazilian architectural photographers. Many of his photographs are actually in the gallery because he photographs a lot of Portuguese, the work of a lot of Portuguese architects. And he actually recreated the exact same shot as the historical image. This, in the 1920s, is that. So in many ways, each of these chapters begin to tell this sort of biography through each of these categories. Then the rest of the book, the second chapter, begins to look at the role of housing and how models of collective living in many ways have actually been a very important component of South American design. Not just in sort of São Paulo and Brazil, but in South America at large. South America has been very inventive in creating new models of how do we actually live vertically, how do we actually live collectively in multifamily housing. And I think today there's a disparity between sort of the richness in terms of design of those projects and larger scale strategies for the introduction of housing, especially affordable housing, in many cities. So part of the book also then began to look at what are the lessons that we can take from sort of this history within South America. And I'm going very quickly here in these points. Each of these points are much more expanded in the book. The third component of the project begins to look at the history of mobility projects throughout the 19th and 20th century, and how mobility projects have actually generated new districts in cities. How investment in mobility infrastructure can be the driver for a much larger set of ambitious set of projects. And you have projects, for example, like Grand Central Terminal. Many people know it in New York City because of the beauty of its station. But in reality, in addition to the station, the great part of that project is that it decked over the rail yards 9 urban blocks that then became developed as brand new real estate, which is what we today know as Park Avenue North. Right, so this investment in mobility infrastructure then generated some of the most sort of desirable real estate in the city. More recent projects, a new intermodal railway station in Torino, where it actually, the railway station covered a significant portion of railway areas. It decked it, and by decking it, it was able to connect two parts of the city that for many years were disconnected. Not that different than many parts of São Paulo, between sort of the city center and the river. And from there, we actually went back to look at the larger history of urban projects for São Paulo. And while I think it's very important to begin to see how sort of, in many ways, foreign influences or foreign references can actually help us rethink part of São Paulo, it is also very important to understand what is the larger history of its projects, right? All the way from sort of the Plan Bovard, a very important plan in late 1900s, late 19th century, early 20th century. Le Corbusier, of course, always also did its appearance through São Paulo, a very important project. Also very important projects that are more recent, like in the 90s, the ABC by the Barcelona-based architect Joan Busquets, one of the first major metropolitan plans for São Paulo. And all of this information, in many ways, became the basis for the development of a series of strategies that bring together mobility, hydrology, and sort of the development of urban morphology, of urban blocks. And that became the premise of a larger series of design strategies, which in the book are explained in detail. Here, I'm just going to synthesize them into 3 drawings, but 3 drawings that I think reveal something very important about São Paulo, the center, and its relation to the river. This is São Paulo in 1842. This is São Paulo today. And what is shocking, in addition to, of course, the growth of the city, is the fact that the river, which used to be a meander, has actually been transformed into a straight line. And this, in many ways, in relation to its relation to other tributaries, is one of the major sort of hydrological issues within the city. The fact that sort of it's very difficult to straitjacket water into a straight line. So, if of course this area between the city center and the Tietê River is highly desirable today, it is only highly desirable if a new hydrological plan can make it readily accessible for urban development. If it's not readily accessible for urban development, developers are just not going to take it. They're just not going to invest in this area. And what we actually sort of propose in this plan, which has many different phases, here I'm just showing the final plan, but we propose a larger strategy that in many ways begins to work with an idea of a transfer of development rights, in which the city might be able to transfer property rights from the edge of the river to other areas that might be more desirable for urban development, and in many ways give back the river some of the space that it actually deserves, but also turn it into an important recreational space within the city. And these are plans that many cities throughout the world have done. Mudou did that very successfully, at a much smaller scale, but very successfully in relation to all the old wine warehouses, right, that are no longer occupied. A city that did something very similar, right, and today it has the best waterfront in America is Chicago. If you actually look at most of the Chicago waterfront in the 50s and 60s, that's where all the heavyweight infrastructure was actually placed. That's where all the rail yards went. That's where all the highways went. And today, it actually has a better waterfront, I would argue, than New York or San Francisco. So in many ways, the project argues for sort of a larger comprehensive strategy that can begin to give the river, in this particular point, a new lease on life and make it part, again, of the life of the city. All of this was actually documented in the book that is being presented here today. And as part of the documentation in the book, we actually were able to also introduce a series of writings and essays, not only from people that were expert in the different fields that make up a sort of the urban. It's not just architecture. So for example, somebody like Marcia Castro, which is an expert on issues of health and public space, wrote quite a beautiful piece on the importance of public space in terms of preventing Zika and the Zika virus. Bruno Carvalho, who is a professor of Portuguese, originally at Princeton. He just moved to Harvard University, wrote a beautiful piece also on sort of the culture of street life in São Paulo, and so on. And in a way, all of these essays, there are 8 in total, began to thicken the plot of the book and begin to give also a different dimension that both has local voices. Alexandre Dejalkov, who has actually done incredible work in terms of hydrology and mobility infrastructure in the city, has another piece, but also bringing people that are not that familiar with São Paulo, but that can also in many ways bring a certain degree of expertise. The book was actually launched in São Paulo last November at a fantastic symposium that took place at INSPIR, where we actually paired many sort of local experts with foreign experts, and established an incredible set of discussions based on the themes of the book. That's an event in a photograph of the event. And in many ways, at the end of the day, what I would actually argue just to conclude is that in many ways the book doesn't claim to be a manual, right, or a fix-it-all project for the waterfront. It is a book that brings together the history of the urban form of the city. And one thing that for me was quite shocking, there are millions of books on São Paulo. If you actually go through any bibliography, there are many, many books on São Paulo. There's not one that explains its history of the urban form. And in many ways, that was for me, the initial objective of this book. The other, and perhaps more important one, is for the book to really be a device that opens up dialogue, that opens up a larger set of discussions within the city, and for it to be a document which other architects, other government officials, public figures can actually use as a reference for future projects. So in many ways, for me, the life of the book doesn't end as soon as, or the life of the project doesn't end as soon as it's published, but it's actually more the beginning of what hopefully will be a series of interactions and conversations, of which the one in November I thought was an incredible example of. So with that, I'll pass the word to Jorge. Thank you.
Thank you. Bom, boa tarde. I think I will do my comment on Portuguese.
Okay.
So to put you on
Then
the
you'll do an
ball.
executive summary in English? No, I understand.
Well, you understand.
I understand, yeah.
You will understand because I will say very straightforward things about your wonderful book. But then I will put you one or two questions
That's
at the
good.
end in English.
Good. Or Portuguese.
Bom, boa tarde a todos, é um prazer estar aqui, obrigado à Note, ao Nuno, ao Felipe por este convite. Eu queria dizer muito sucintamente e muito brevemente que de facto estamos perante um projeto e um livro que é sem dúvida muito corajoso no sentido intelectual do termo, porque eu conheço, como o Nuno disse há pouco, eu conheço São Paulo e visito São Paulo e já vivi em São Paulo no Copan durante 3 meses e portanto sinto-me habilitado um pouquinho para falar sobre São Paulo, mas eu visito São Paulo e trabalho em São Paulo e sou investidor em São Paulo nos últimos 10, 20 anos e de facto, São Paulo é uma cidade extraordinariamente complexa, como todos sabem, e extraordinariamente difícil no sentido também intelectual e físico do termo. E para pegar numa cidade como São Paulo e em 2 anos, 3 anos, fazer este trabalho, fazer este levantamento, fazer este diagnóstico, fazer estas propostas que não são uma receita, mas avançam bastante no modo como podemos ver São Paulo, é de facto uma empreitada, é de facto um trabalho muito extraordinário, eu diria. E eu de facto, como dizia o Filipe há pouco, andei à procura nas livrarias de São Paulo, desde a primeira vez que lá fui, sobre livros, sobre a história da forma de São Paulo. E de facto é difícil encontrar, por razões que a gente depois podia também pensar um pouco. Em qualquer dos casos, aqui temos uma cidade que é, como foi dito, essencialmente uma cidade do século XX. Isto é extraordinário, não é? Porque é uma cidade que no século XX cresce mais do que qualquer outra cidade do globo, eu diria. Portanto, é uma cidade cujo crescimento entre os anos 20 e os anos 90 é exponencial, é planetário e, de facto, talvez agora com pouca modéstia profissional, se não são os arquitetos, se não são os urbanistas a pensar sobre uma cidade deste calibre, então não sabemos bem quem é que pode ser. Porque os arquitetos, os urbanistas, estão obrigados, digamos assim, a ter uma visão de conjunto. Estão obrigados a ter uma visão que mistura a história com a sociologia, com a economia, com a arte, e de alguma forma é isso que o Filipe nos traz aqui. E o que é também extraordinário no livro é que não é só um ensaio, digamos, teórico, mas é também um livro com muitos desenhos, com muitos gráficos, com muita informação, como no título aliás consta, que nos dá informação gráfica e visual sobre São Paulo. E isso é também um lado que eu considero extraordinariamente importante. Reparem, um dos momentos mais bonitos da história urbanística de São Paulo, que está retratado no livro, é quando o Corbusier, o velho mestre da arquitetura moderna, chega a São Paulo com a ingenuidade e o voluntarismo dos europeus e diz que São Paulo, que o futuro de São Paulo se pode traçar com uma cruz. Imaginem imaginem o que é São Paulo com uma cruz passada norte-sul, leste-oeste. Enfim, seria uma cidade bastante diferente, mas mostra como de facto estava tudo, nos anos 20 estava tudo em aberto para a cidade de São Paulo e de facto o crescimento é absolutamente extraordinário. Eu queria só dizer uma ou duas coisas. Estamos aqui a falar com pessoas que são, uma boa parte são do Brasil e portanto, enfim, direi apenas banalidades, mas eu queria contar esta história muito rapidamente, que me marcou profundamente na vivência de São Paulo. Uma vez convidaram-me para ir falar à Universidade de Campinas, foram buscar ao Copan, levaram-me a Campinas, e depois no regresso, ao fim da tarde, nunca esquecerei, na autoestrada de acesso a São Paulo, ao fim da tarde, às 5, às 6 da tarde, havia uma fila contínua de caminhões a entrar na cidade de São Paulo. Uma fila contínua. O que é uma coisa absolutamente extraordinária, porque provavelmente, na verdade, deviam estar a sair, hipoteticamente, mas mostra como São Paulo é uma cidade de pura logística. De pura logística. Para alimentar São Paulo, e eu estava do lado de Campinas e dos outros lados, dos vários outros lados de São Paulo, seria o mesmo espectro absolutamente extraordinário, que é uma fila de quilómetros de caminhões entrarem dentro de São Paulo para que São Paulo pudesse acordar e sobreviver no dia seguinte. Bom, isso marcou-me extraordinariamente, marcou, como eu dizia há pouco, a vivência ao longo destes anos, mas depois 3 meses vivendo com a minha família no Copan, e o Copan, que é um dos temas muito bem tratado no livro do Felipe, que é um sítio extraordinário, que toda a gente conhece aqui, não é? Mas é um sítio extraordinário porque é um projeto falhado, que é um projeto maravilhoso. Não se esqueçam que o Copan é um projeto abandonado pelo Oscar Niemeyer, em crise com o empreiteiro, com transformações que não estavam previstas, não seguindo o projeto, etc. Portanto, não é propriamente o Ibirapuera, por exemplo, que é, obviamente, um plano e um projeto conseguido a muitos níveis. O Copan é um projeto falhado, aliás, falhado no sentido arquitetónico. No sentido da técnica, nas biografias do Oscar Niemeyer nem aparecia a certa altura. Mas é, na verdade, um projeto e um edifício e uma cidade que se mantém e que se revigora e que se relança ano após ano. E eu acho isto uma marca de São Paulo extraordinária. Como é que um projeto falhado pode ser um projeto maravilhoso? Como é que uma cidade pode ser, digamos, encapsulada e enquadrada naquele edifício de um modo extraordinário que eu pude viver, digamos assim, não é? O que vocês, com certeza, conhecem sobre o Copan é a microescala daqueles pequenos átrios com os elevadores que nos levam para a grande escala de São Paulo. O que é extraordinário é que no Copan estamos perante um edifício privado, individual, que também é democrático à sua maneira. É um edifício modernista e, portanto, socialista, progressista, mas é um edifício profundamente liberal na sua gênese. E, portanto, há uma série de contradições e uma série de qualidades que, de alguma forma, se nós tivermos que escolher, provavelmente o Copan significa, daquela maneira densa e daquela maneira desenhada ao mesmo tempo, o melhor de São Paulo, e o livro do Felipe faz-lhe justiça a muitos níveis. Bom, eu queria dizer, antes de passar diretamente para algumas perguntas do Felipe, dizer que, de facto, deixa-me só dar esta nota. Eu, como professor de História, de Teoria, enfim, acho que, e vocês percebem isso, acho que para qualquer disciplina, para a política, para a economia, para a sociologia, para as artes, se nós queremos ter um exercício desafiante, um exercício extremo, então São Paulo é esse exercício. Não é? Pensar São Paulo do ponto de vista urbanístico, ou arquitetónico, ou artístico, ou sociológico, ou político, é o exercício por excelência. É por isso que eu queria cumprimentar e celebrar muito o Filipe, porque é pegar, e foi isso também que me tocou profundamente quando eu cheguei a São Paulo a primeira vez, em 2003, muito inocente. Não é? E entrei em São Paulo e a minha vida mudou. A minha vida mudou ao ponto de eu ter uma encomenda, imaginem vocês, eu tinha uma encomenda importante da Universidade de Coimbra para escrever sobre Roma, para fazer um texto sobre Roma, por uma razão. E eu consegui fazer um texto sobre São Paulo, chamando-lhe Roma ao contrário. Roma ao contrário é amor, naturalmente. E portanto vejam como eu estava tão tocado que arranjei uma forma de convencer a editora e convencer quem me estava a convidar para escrever um texto sobre São Paulo em vez de escrever o texto sobre Roma. E portanto esse foi também a parte que me tocou muito, and I want to really congratulate Philip on this occasion. I was telling the audience, our friends, that first time I went there, I went a little bit crazy because I was not expecting such a strong and incredible, powerful experience. And I had this commitment of writing a text about Roma, and I managed to write about São Paulo as Roma in reverse. So that goes to show how really embraced your book, because it really gave me a lot of answers and a lot of questions, of course. And I think your diagnosis and your, even though it's a very reflexive book, but the idea that the problem is the hydrology, and the problem is mobility, and the problem is the rehabilitation of industrial areas, I think it's very spot on, and I think it's really, well, very thoughtful diagnosis, I think. But I missed one or two things that I want to ask you about. What I think it's very moving nowadays in São Paulo is the opening up of Avenida Paulista at the end of the week, weekend, it's Saturday, Sunday.
Yeah. The closing of making it pedestrian.
Yeah, the opening to the pedestrians, or the closing to the cars. So I think that is a very moving experience, because all the utopian visions of the Paulista school of, you know, giving the ground floor to everybody is now not in an architectural way, but it's now in action in this experience. And the other thing that I missed in your book, and of course I'm doing now a critical kind of approach that it goes with the territory, as you know, as an academic. I missed a little bit of architecture in these, for instance, these three examples: the Moreira Salles Institute,
Yeah.
and 24 de Maio Sesc of Mendes Rocha, and also the Praça das Artes of Brazil. And I was intrigued by that the idea that architecture was a little bit missing, not in the beginning, not in the middle, but at the end of your book. And I want to ask you if you think that architecture is perhaps a part of the problem and not part of the solution, or put it in another way, do you think that perhaps it's too big a work and too overwhelming to go and think and dwell with a city like São Paulo through architecture? And another question in the same vein, do you think that the modernist tradition is more like a burden than really a functional legacy?
Okay, then. First of all, thank you for all the compliments and for taking the time to look at the book so carefully. That means a lot to me. So thank you for that. In terms of the questions, there were many, so and I have a terrible memory. But let's start with the architectural one because I think that one's extremely interesting. When we were doing the book, we had that very discussion. And the reason why we didn't include more contemporary projects is because for us it was first of all the projects that we included, with the exception of housing, which had its own logic, are projects that are urban, right? And you can actually argue that the Moreira Salles Institute is a very urban project. It's actually a beautiful architectural and urban project. But we actually decided to cap the projects in the 1980s, with one exception, which is the Unbuilt project by Angelo Vici, who's a dear friend, but I'll never forgive it. In a way, it was about a new vision for the park. But the reason why we decided to cap it in the 1980s is because we wanted the book to be about canonical references and not to become who got included and who didn't. Right. So for us, the issue was if we put we cannot include everyone, right? And if we actually made it a catalog of contemporary practices, it would have been, oh, why is this person there?
The curating kind of.
And for us, it was very important that the book, in many ways, does not address that, right? Do I think architecture is a problem? No. In fact, architecture is one of the greatest assets that São Paulo and Brazil has as an export to the world. Not only São Paulo has incredible Brazilian architects, São Paulo has world-class architects that happen to live in São Paulo. They happen to be from São Paulo. And I think the city, in many ways, showcases that, and the book showcases that. For us, that was actually very important. The closing of Avenida Paulista is an interesting one because it is in the book. It is actually, there's one drawing specifically as a new form of public space.
Okay.
So it's in one page. So of course I don't explain. It is a very minimal moment, right? In the city of voids.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why we didn't amplify that is because closing Avenida Paulista is not a design move.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a design project. It's an urban policy project. And the reason why you can actually do it is because over the years, Paulista has become an incredible urban space. So we're interested in projects that shape urban space.
Mm-hmm.
We're a little bit less interested in urban actions that happen within those spaces. One, because of scope, but two, because I do think that there are many disciplines and many other sort of literature that address that. In fact, the closing of Avenida Paulista has been case studies in many different books. But the shape of Paulista, the section, I didn't show it in this presentation, but in the book, in one of the chapters, there's a photograph of Avenida Paulista in the 1920s and the exact same photograph today. And we explained that transformation in the verticalization chapter. And for us, it was more about sort of the harshness of the change, of the shift in urban form in 50 or 60 years, than in this more sort of nuanced operations that we're seeing today. So it was a question of choices. And it's there, but it's there in a more remedial manner.
And what about the modernist tradition? Do you think it's a burden more than?
No, I don't think it's no, I think it's actually one of the amazing things about Brazil and about São Paulo specifically, and we were discussing this earlier, is that modernism has had a continuum. It's also a place where modernism shaped the larger ideals of a particular society. And I think that there are very few sort of cities and countries in the world where architecture has had such, and modernism in particular, an important role in shaping its citizens. in shaping its subjects, all the way from Belo Horizonte, right, to Goiânia, to then Brasilia, right? The idea of actually creating capital cities doesn't start with Brasilia. It started with many other sort of modern cities built from scratch, where through architecture, through urbanism, you inscribe a new form of citizen. And I think that that's a legacy that has to be celebrated, because it's been overall very successful in my opinion. But I am also a hardcore modernist deep inside, so I might be a little bit biased.
Fair enough, fair enough. But one just last comment. What I was trying to say is that the question of developing and reforming São Paulo is such an overwhelming kind of job, then perhaps architecture is a little bit too minor aspect. If you're talking about hydrology, or if you're talking about mobility, the thing is, you can have this very beautiful building like Moreira Salles or Praça das Artes, and that changes the temperament, the culture, and the ambient of the city. But when you, as you say, when you close the Avenida Paulista, it can be an act of policy, not an act of architecture. But I'm challenging you in thinking that that is perhaps an act of architecture.
No,
and not just a policy act.
No, of course, it is an act of architecture, but it's a form of activism, right? But at the end of the day, I think for me the key issue has to do with the definition of what are we using the term architecture for, right? And architecture is not only the design of buildings. That's one component of architecture. But I do think that architecture as a discipline has an incredible ability to establish spatial synthesis. And that spatial synthesis comes from sort of taking parts and pieces from many other disciplines. So as São Paulo sort of looks towards the future, like many other cities throughout the world, there has to be processes of urban transformation that bring many different factors, right? That's why, for example, we talk a lot in the book about transfer of development rights, right? Because issues of economics and how do you actually make land desirable is essential. Issues of hydrology and how do you actually bring today environmental and ecological sensitivity into the daily life of the city is essential, right? Issues of ecological restoration. So sort of ecology, landscape architecture plays an incredible role. And at the end of the day, I think we need to expand the notion of the urban project, not as big buildings, big architecture, but as a series of design procedures that adapt to a greater whole, and that bring all these disciplines together. But at the end of the day, if it has to do with sort of the form of the city, I'm not saying that architecture is going to lead the project, but the discipline of architecture is going to have to play a very important role. And from my perspective, that is sort of the discipline that I push forward, because as we said before, nobody's going to do that job for us as architects. Right.
Just one last question. As you know, there is this big debate now in São Paulo about the demolition of Minhocão.
Yeah.
And the highway that was not completed, and then it was like a frontier. And I think there was these two polar positions on the demolition or the change towards a Highline Park kind of project in New York.
Yeah.
And I think I heard that Paul Rocha was defending the demolition and not the rehabilitation idea. What do you think about that? Do you think it must be demolished or Highline Park?
Do I need to choose? No.
You have to.
No, I see your point. I think it's a great question. But I think before we answer that question, I think it's important to understand what the High Line is, because the High Line is sort of sold. The High Line in New York, everybody knows the High Line is one of the most visible projects. So, but it's sold as a rehabilitation of an old infrastructure. It is actually a transfer of development rights project. And it is a project that was actually pushed forward by Amanda Burton, who was the director of city planning during Mayor Bloomberg's term, back then when we had a good mayor. And basically, why did they want to tear the High Line down? Because people owned the parcels underneath the High Line. So when the Friends of the High Line came and said, well, we should make an elevated park, they said, that is a wonderful idea, but not over my property. Go build a park somewhere else. And the Friends of the Highland, who are actually, who were sort of really the main architects, two citizens that actually came together to advance the project, said, you know what? Why don't we preserve the Highland? But we'll pay face value, we'll pay sort of present day value for your land. You'll get the money for your land plus a bonus. And then we're going to get that FAR, the amount of buildable area that we can build on your land, and we're going to put it in key sites along the High Line. And then if developers want to actually improve the quality of the public space, we're going to give them an even greater bonus. So they're going to be able to build taller. So it was a project that actually, even for the Bloomberg administration, it ended up being more profitable than they ever imagined. They never imagined it was going to be so successful. So the point that I'm trying to make with this project in São Paulo is that I don't think the debate is about tearing it down or keeping it. The debate is about what is the urban project that is going to drive the transformation of the area. If you tear it, fine. It'll be replaced, it'll become a boulevard. If you actually keep it, it could become a nice elevated park depending on how it actually is developed. But what matters are the larger sort of economic incentives and the vision that you want for that district, which is not just the elevated piece, but its edges. So I wouldn't be in favor of tearing it down or keeping it. I would be in favor of a smart project that can allow you to transform that area.
I would like to ask Felipe something. Do you think that, the approach you have, some proposals that, or at least hypotheses that you put, that could be transferred to other global cities? Do you think there are places that could be closer to what you think about São Paulo, maybe other places in South America? Or,
well,
how do you see this project globally, or what are the forwards that you can give us from your book to other places?
No, I think that's a great question, and it's something that we've thought a lot, which is that in many ways for us, this book is about São Paulo specifically, but it's also a model in the form of a blueprint as to how to read cities. So one thing that for me is actually highly transferable is the methodology of actually being able to understand cities through drawing. That for me is essential. And how you actually understand a city, I mean, drawing is a form of language, right? So for us, being able to draw the city, we learned a new language through sort of drawing São Paulo. The other issue is that we always say, oh, São Paulo is such an exotic city that nobody understands. It goes for sort of miles and miles and it's unmanageable. But at the end of the day, São Paulo is a city that grew at an exponential rate with economic pressures, not unlike many other cities in the world. Shanghai, very different cultures. But the pressures and the geometries, primarily of infrastructure, are very similar. The fact that sort of it's a city that grew in a moment where the modernist silos separated disciplines, right? So engineering was separated from architecture, was separated from civic art. So mobility infrastructure became primarily monofunctional. Mexico City has the exact same program. Of course, today it is very easy to criticize those ideas, right? But we always have to remember that the solutions that we admired 40 years ago are the problems that we're dealing with today. I mean, the highways were in every single architectural magazine. Today, architects hate cars, right? But in the 1940s and 1950s, the Futurama was dedicated to sort of the idea of seamless mobility in cars. So I think going back to your point, what is incredibly transferable is that Sao Paulo was at the forefront of development at a very particular moment in time. And today it has to be at the forefront of how it rethinks many of those issues that were the solutions of the 1960s and that are the issues that we have to deal with in 2019.
Não sei se alguém quer.
Like question.
Claudio.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think it's great, your hydrology project, and also you mentioned there is a good part in the book about the use of warehouses and land along the rail lines for affordable housing. But it seemed to me that you are linking the two, the hydrology and the warehouse. I didn't understand exactly why, because it seems to me that the second use of warehouses is more short-term and medium-term and costs less, because hydrology is a very complex thing and long-term and costs a lot of money.
But I think the issue, for sure. But I think that if you really want to transform this area and make it a part of the city, that investment in hydrology infrastructure needs to happen. And that investment needs to happen. It cannot happen democratically, and it cannot happen in just one spot. Cities that have actually addressed issues of hydrology successfully, there are certain infrastructures that require to be done in a large scale, or if not, they don't work. So I think the warehouses then, I'm not in favor of keeping all of the warehouses. By the way, there are some that are historic that are quite beautiful that should be kept. But what we explain in the book is the reorganization of the parcel structure for it to become desirable for a scale that addresses housing. Because if you really can address issues of hydrology and reorganize the structure of the blocks, this area between the center and the river becomes, I think, a very highly desirable area for development in the future. You can bike endlessly, you never get a hill, right? It could actually be marketed in a very different way. It also becomes a great epicenter for inner city affordable housing. And that's why a lot of the focus in the book looks at how do you actually rethink issues of affordability, not only as sort of bringing affordable housing to the center of the city, but about mixed income. One of the problems that South America in general has is that affordable housing is a financial formula affiliated to the type of a house, which, by the way, is a model, it's based on Parsons and the family unit of four that absolutely sort of worked for the development of the American suburb. It was actually very detrimental for middle lower classes in South America because the unit of four was not the family structure. The family structure is that of the extended family and sort of in-laws and sort of kids that live in the house. So in many ways, the idea of new mixed income models, I think for me, is much more promising.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you match mentality, culture, Paulistano and Brazilian with those buildings?
With those what?
With those buildings.
Right.
How do you match everything? Like the service of the buildings, like build and rebuild and just see so beautiful things, but when you look inside, then you have to deal with those cultures and mentality. How do you do? In your opinion, like that?
You mean how do you actually change the mindset of people?
How do you match? Because everything just so beautiful, but
Right.
I don't know why to match everything that's the city has is beautiful things, that's
Right.
the good things, with the more important thing, that's people. Like
Right.
you have buildings with people, so how do you match the mentality and the culture
Right.
with all of this?
Well, I think for me, it has to do with sort of understanding that as important as some of the institutions in the city are, and I don't mean institutions in terms of, but sort of the cultural mores, the habits are, they are sort of artificial. they've been constructed, right? And that as time changes, as society evolves, these things have to adapt. So just to give you an example, if you actually look at a much smaller scale, the role of environmental law, the role that environmental law has played, for example, in the state of São Paulo, has changed drastically from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century. So, for example, how the environment was treated in the construction of hydroelectric dams was very different, right? So, at this point in time, for example, I do think that São Paulo has to seriously look at issues of ecology, because on how ecology is managed is going to depend. The city that sort of children that are 2 or 3 right now inherit is going to depend enormously on how sort of ecological policies are actually put in place. And I think that is tied directly to issues of public space. It's tied directly to issues of civic identity. And that's why there are many cities. Madrid, 10 years ago, if you asked anybody that lived in Madrid, if Madrid had a river, most likely they would say no. The Manzanares River, very important river. But it is not until the Madrid-Rio project, which is a fantastic project in many ways, also a very expensive project in many others, where they sunk the highway underneath the river, which is ridiculous. But they sunk the highway and sort of created this brand new park on top of it. And now suddenly Madrid has a river it never had before. The most desirable public space in the city today. But more importantly, all the buildings that actually gave the back to the river now are beginning to completely change. And many of them have actually open entrances on the other side. Right? So in many ways, I think a key feature of this, of changing habits, is investing in public space. Because the moment that you actually put money in public works, the private sector, I think, responds very productively. That was the strategy of Barcelona in the 80s. The recuperation of over 250 small-scale parks. The point was not to improve the parks. The point was that the moment that they saw that the city was investing in the parks, everybody started painting their houses, right? And I think that there has to be public-private partnerships that begin to change the mindset in the way that you begin to develop certain parts of the city.
Não sei se há mais perguntas. O livro do Felipe está aqui disponível. Anote vendo o livro, se alguém estiver interessado. E, entretanto, será oferecido um vinho às pessoas presentes, se estiverem. Sendo assim, dou a conversa por encerrada. Agradeço a presença de todos, em meu nome e do Felipe. Muito obrigado. Espero que tenha sido um final de tarde interessante e pronto, que tenha trazido algo novo a cada um dos presentes. Muito obrigado.